husband. Overheard my sister joke. That my son looks nothing like him. The room went silent. Enzo and I were the exact same kind of person when it came to ambition. We had the kind of drive that eats away at weekends and replaces date nights with late-night calls and grueling work. We met at a business convention about 8 years ago. I was forced to go and network as the face of the firm by my bosses while he was there to pitch to some investors for his company. I still remember how we ended up talking in the hallway afterward. Our conversation somehow drifted from market trends to music to just about everything. And I could never forget just how easily he made me laugh. It felt like fate that we met. Two people who always thought they were too busy for love finding it anyway, squeezed in between meetings and schedules. From the start, our relationship in a way took second place to our work. He was an entrepreneur and ran his own company while I worked at an influential law firm. His life revolved around strategy and innovation, and mine meant constantly juggling clients and taking on new cases. Between his travel schedule and my late nights at the office, it was normal for us to go days without seeing each other awake. Most mornings he'd leave before I got up, and by the time I returned home, he'd be asleep. It wasn't ideal, but somehow it worked for us. We understood each other's world, and we respected it. For years, that mutual understanding was enough. We'd reconnect during brief breaks. There would be weekends when neither of us had to check our phones, and moments during the week where we made time for each other. People would ask how we managed it all, and I'd always laugh it off and say that we didn't have the time to fight, and even if we did, we'd probably be too tired to do it. And it was true. Which is why I was so surprised when Enzo brought up the idea of having a baby. It was a quiet Sunday morning, one of those rare days when work didn't bleed into our downtime. I was curled up on the couch, scrolling through emails and only half listening to him talk about his plans for the week when he suddenly said, "I think it's time we start a family." I remember the way I instantly paused what I was doing and then waited for him to speak again, hoping that I'd heard him wrong. I looked up from my phone and then I asked, "A baby?" He smiled like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Yeah, a baby." "Don't you think it's time?" I didn't. Not even close. We barely had time for each other. How were we supposed to fit a child into that chaos? But he kept talking, gently but persistently, and he painted this picture of what it would be like. He said he was ready for the next chapter and ready to slow down a little. I wasn't sure if I believed that part. I didn't think we were both cut out for slow domestic lives, but there was something hopeful in the way he said it that made me want to believe. And so eventually I agreed to set out times where we could try for one. We scheduled nights to have sex that coincided with my fertile days and everything. In the end, I got pregnant, though it wasn't how we planned it, but more on that later. Pregnancy wasn't easy for me. The morning sickness hit hard, and between that and the pressure at work, I was constantly exhausted. Enzo tried to help, but he was just as busy as I was, and half the time his version of helping was sending flowers to my office or scheduling massages I barely had time to attend. Still, when our son was born, something inside him changed. For me, though, everything felt different in a way I didn't expect or understand. I loved our son, I really did, but I didn't feel what I thought I was supposed to. Everyone talked about that instant bond and that overwhelming rush of love. I didn't get that. Instead, I felt tired, disconnected, and guilty. I felt all the wrong things, and I had no idea what to do about it. Enzo, on the other hand, took to fatherhood effortlessly. He was patient in ways I wasn't. He was always the first to wake up when the baby cried, and he always remembered doctor's appointments and feeding schedules. I watched him with this quiet mix of admiration and resentment because he made it look so easy. When my maternity leave ended, I went back to work almost immediately. I told myself it was because I missed it, and because I needed to feel like myself again after nursing and changing diapers for weeks. But deep down, I knew it was because I didn't know how to be around my son or Enzo for that long. At first, we tried to share the responsibility, taking turns picking him up from daycare and alternating taking him out and spending time with him, but soon it became clear that someone had to give more than the other. And that someone was always Enzo. He started leaving work earlier and doing most of his work at home so he could be more present for our son. I told him I appreciated it, and I did, but I also felt like something changed between us. In a way, we stopped being equals. He was putting in way more work than I was when it came to raising him, and I couldn't deny it. And it wasn't like he didn't notice it too. There was always this quiet disapproval in his eyes whenever I missed another bedtime or forgot a school event. The balance that once made our relationship work started to crumble. I could feel him pulling away from me because of my absence, but I didn't know how to fix it. Our house became quieter. The little space we used to share turned into separate worlds. There was him with our son and me with my work. We were still partners on paper, but in reality, it was like we were living different lives. I didn't want that. I didn't want to be the one who put a dent in our lives. So I tried my hardest to be more present and make out more time for both of them. And it worked, for a while. The years that followed were quieter. Not perfect, not even close, but manageable in its own way. Our son grew older, and with time, we learned how to coexist in our own rhythm again. We split duties as best as we could. We shared school runs, family events, and doctor's visits between us. I still worked long hours, but I tried harder to show up when it mattered. Enzo stopped expecting perfection from me, or maybe he just stopped hoping for it, and eventually we reached a new balance that worked for us. We were busy, but we functioned. We made routines and we stuck to them. It was what was best for everyone, and it gave our lives some semblance of order and normalcy. We had dinner together at least 3 nights a week, and we always had some kind of family outing every other weekend. It was things like that that kept our life stable and made it feel like we'd figured it out again. But that balance didn't last forever, and eventually what we'd worked so hard for came undone in the worst way. It started a few months ago, and it started with a string of small mix-ups. I'd get caught up in meetings and forget to send reminders for pickup times. Enzo would assume I was handling it. And then we'd both rush to the school at the last minute, always apologizing and always making our son the last child to get picked up. At first, it was almost funny. We'd laugh it off and promise to be more organized next time. But as it kept happening, more often than it should have, it stopped being funny. It just kept getting worse. There were missed pickups and recitals, showing up late for birthdays, and getting last-minute gifts that didn't mean much. And the truth was, it was mostly me. I was the one who kept screwing up and letting everything else get in the way of family. That's what led to the morning Enzo finally brought it up. He was standing by the counter, dressed for work but clearly not ready to leave yet, when he asked if we could talk. So of course, I set my mug and my phone down, and I said sure. His tone was serious but not angry, and it caught me off guard a little bit. I asked him what he wanted to talk about, and he looked at me like he was trying to choose his words carefully before he said, "About how I've been. Handling most of the school stuff lately. Pickups, appointments, everything really." My immediate instinct was to deny it, so I did. I told him that it wasn't true, and he didn't even try to argue with me. He just gave me this tired look and said, "You know it is." I tried to explain to him that I'd just been busy, and things at work had been insane at the moment, but he just calmly told me that he understood. His job was like that too, but he still made time for other things. He still made it work. I asked if he was accusing me of not trying to make things work and choosing my job over family, but he just said that he felt like I just stopped trying. That one hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to argue, but then stopped. He wasn't wrong. Not completely. But I hated how easily he said it, like it was that simple and I hadn't been fighting to hold everything together. He didn't know the full truth, and how could he? I was the one hiding things and being neglectful. So I promised him that he would do better and try harder, and he nodded and pulled me in for a hug. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few weeks later, it happened again. I fucked up again. Only this time, it was worse. It was supposed to be my day to pick up our son. I'd set a reminder on my phone and everything. I'd even told Enzo not to worry about it. But then things just caught up with me that day. I was completely out of it, and before I knew it, the school was closing. By the time I realized what time it was, my heart dropped into my stomach. I checked my phone to see like 13 missed calls from Enzo and 2 from the school. I called him back immediately, but he didn't answer. When I finally got home that night, the house was quiet in a way that made me uneasy. Enzo was sitting in the living room with his jacket still on, and he had this frustrated look on his face. He looked up when I walked in. "You forgot again." His voice was sharp and irritated. I tried to say something about how I didn't forget and just lost track of time, but he cut me off. "You did. Even after what we talked about, you did it again." He exhaled and shook his head. The school called me at 4. He was the last kid there. Everyone else had gone home. His teacher had to stay behind with him. I dropped my bag on the floor and went to him, already feeling horrible and guilty. I'm sorry. I apologized and then tried to tell him again how work had been a lot. Work has been hard, he finished for me, sounding bitter. Yeah, you've said that 1,000 times already. But work's hard for me too. That doesn't mean I leave our son sitting in the principal's office for hours. My throat tightened. Don't make it sound like I abandoned him. Didn't you? He asked quietly. And those words silenced me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I could feel the anger coming off of him. I felt it in everything he said. He leaned forward and he asked, "What's going on with you?" Really? Because this isn't just about work. I tried to play it off and tell him that I just had a lot going on and it caused me to slip up. I told him that people make mistakes, sometimes it just happens. He stayed quiet for a bit, and then after a moment he said, "You've been different." Around him and around me. This is what you were like when we first had him, but I thought you'd changed. His voice sounded as broke as I felt, but I guess not. You barely talk anymore, and when you're home, it's like you can't wait to leave again. His words felt too sharp, and I wanted to tell him about everything, but I couldn't. I wanted to apologize, but I couldn't do that either. When I opened my mouth, all that came out was defensiveness. I snapped at him and told him to stop, and that him judging me wasn't helping. He told me that he wasn't judging and that he was just trying to understand what was going on with me. I accused him of trying to make me seem like the bad guy, and he asked what I was even talking about. I was overwhelmed with his accusations and everything else that was going on, so I just let it all out, even all the things that I didn't mean. I told him that he was just upset because I wasn't the one sacrificing everything anymore, and that he probably hated that I was now earning more than him. I said that he wasn't bothered by my absence, but because his fragile masculinity couldn't handle that I was doing better. The words were cruel, and I knew it even as I said them. And they weren't even true, not really. But it was easier to be angry than to admit I was exhausted and that I felt like I was drowning in every part of my life. Enzo just stared at me for a long moment, his expression shifting from frustration to disbelief. "You think this is about money?" he asked. "You think I care who earns more?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. He stood up slowly and then shook his head like he was disappointed. "You know what? I'd be fine with you being the breadwinner. I'd even be proud. But not if it turns you into a cold person and a bad mother." The words took the air right out of me, and I didn't even know how to respond. He didn't wait for a response anyway. He just turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the living room with my eyes tearing up. For a while I just stood there, staring at the floor with his words echoing in my head. Cold person, bad mother. And then the tears finally came. I sank onto the couch, covered my face with my hands, and cried until my chest ached, not just because of what he said, but because deep down, I knew there was truth buried somewhere in it. He wasn't wrong. I hadn't been the best mother. And I hadn't lied when I told him work had been bad. He just didn't know how much those two things were connected. He didn't understand how the mess at my job and the guilt in my chest were knotted together so tightly that sometimes I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It wasn't that I didn't love my son. I did. But from a distance. Because the reason why I struggled to be around him was something I could never tell Enzo. The truth went back years. Back to before the wedding. Before I became Enzo's wife, I was just another overworked paralegal trying to build a name for herself in a popular firm that chewed up and spat out whoever couldn't keep up. That was where I met Scott. Scott was my supervisor back then. He was smart, confident, and charming in this effortless way that made everyone like him. And he wasn't just good at his job, he was kind too. He always took the time to walk me through cases, and he made all those impossible deadlines feel manageable. When I first started, he went out of his way to make me feel like I belonged at the firm. In a way, he was also kind of a mentor to me. It was innocent, all of it, at least at first. We spent a lot of time together. We had to back then. There was a lot of reading through contracts, drafting briefs, and eating takeout in the middle of it all. Somewhere along the line, our working relationship started to look less like work and more like something else. It wasn't planned. I wasn't looking for it. But there was just something about him and about the way he always used to look at me like I was the only person in the room. He'd compliment me in passing. He would say something nice about my insight or my work ethic or the way I carried myself. He'd wait by the elevators at the end of most days so we could walk out together. Sometimes when it was late and the streets were mostly empty, he'd insist on walking me to my car. It felt harmless and safe. It also just felt nice to have so much support at the office. At the time, Enzo and I were both buried in our careers. He was working on a major project at his company, which meant working longer shifts, flying in and out of town for meetings, and that we barely saw each other. It was one of the things that confused me about his want for a baby, since we were hardly ever with each other. I missed him, but I also resented how absent he was. And Scott was there to fill that space without me realizing how easily he was slipping into the cracks of my life. It started with the small things. We were constantly laughing and having a good time together, even while working. And during those late nights at work, when the workload was over with, we'd order food and just talk about anything that came to mind. Then came the nights when Enzo would text that he wouldn't be home until after midnight, and Scott would offer to drive me instead of letting me take a cab alone. Sometimes he'd even walk me inside and wait for me to lock the door. And on rare occasions, he'd make me a quick dinner or just something to eat before heading home himself. I told myself it was just friendship because it was easier to ignore whatever it was that Scott stirred in me. So I told myself it all meant nothing. Enzo never knew about those nights, and he never knew about Scott. I kept it all from him, and I told myself that as long as nothing physical happened, there was nothing to confess. But deep down, I knew the line was already gone. I tried to pull back, and I tried to put space between us. I really did. But it was harder than I thought. I mean, first of all, we worked together. We had to stay close. But also it was just generally difficult for me to just avoid him and completely disregard our friendship. I knew that not distancing myself was dangerous. I knew that. But I just couldn't bring myself to do it. To be perfectly honest, I just wanted to be around him. And the awful truth was that we'd had more than a few close calls, moments where we got too close or brushed up against each other in all the ways that were wrong but felt right. And in those moments, it was hard to deny feeling something for him. Still, I tried to take a step back and keep things strictly about work, but it didn't last. It never does. And then one night, everything came undone. Enzo had called earlier to say he'd be home late again and tell me something about a big client dinner he couldn't miss. Scott and I had been working on a particularly stressful case then and didn't finish until almost 9. He offered to drop me home, and I didn't have the energy to refuse. Once we got to the house, he walked me in like usual. I remember how quiet it was inside and how easy it was to slip into that familiar routine of watching him while he made me something to eat. I don't know why I said yes when he suggested watching a movie. Maybe I didn't want to be alone again, or maybe I just wanted to feel wanted. I'm not sure. We sat on the couch and got comfortable. In the beginning, it was easy to pretend, but after only a few minutes, it was obvious that neither of us were actually watching. We were both too focused on being so close to each other. When I finally looked at him, he was already looking at me, and the way he just stared at me made my mouth go dry. All the feelings I'd been ignoring for months were not suddenly on the surface, and I didn't know how to hold them back or if I even really wanted to. "You know there's something between us," he said softly after he moved even closer. I didn't answer. It was hard to with the way my pulse was hammering in my ears. "I know you feel it too," was what he whispered to me when he cupped my cheek. And he wasn't wrong. I did. I wasn't even sure what exactly it was that I felt, just that I couldn't deny it. I'd been fighting it for months, burying it under loyalty and fear, but in that moment, all of that gave way to something I still can't name. I should have stopped him when he leaned in. I should have told him to leave, but I didn't. The kiss was slow at first, kind of hesitant and testing, but then it deepened quickly and became something hungry and desperate. Kissing led to fumbling around with clothes and then taking them off. It led to crossing lines and doing things that couldn't be undone. It led to one of the biggest mistakes of my life. I had sex with Scott that night. It happened right there on the couch, and it was quick and a bit clumsy, but it wasn't bad. I hate that I can't say it was bad, and the worst sex of my life. When it was over, the guilt settled in, and it made the whole house feel smaller, like it would suffocate me. I couldn't look at him or say anything to him. Not for a while anyway. I was still in disbelief over what I'd done. Eventually, I told him to leave. My voice was shaking like crazy. He tried to speak, but I couldn't bear to hear it. I just wanted him gone. And after he left, I sat there in silence, staring at the empty spot beside me. The panic came in slowly as I noticed the time and that Enzo would be back soon. I was practically shaking with fear when I cleaned up the place and then showered until my skin hurt, as if I could wash away what I'd done. When Enzo walked in later, exhausted and distracted, but ultimately happy to see me, I felt awful. I had to force a smile with him, and luckily, he didn't notice anything was off. I told myself that what happened with Scott could just be a mistake that I buried in the past. I convinced myself that if I just never spoke of it, it would disappear. But secrets don't disappear. They had a habit of lingering around until the worst possible moment. I didn't know just how much I had messed up that night with Scott until weeks later, when I started feeling sick. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion, but then the morning sickness and the dizziness came. I knew what the tests would say when I bought them, but I took them anyway, and I sat on the bathroom floor for hours when I saw those 2 lines appear. I should have felt joy since Enzo and I had already discussed kids and had agreed to try for one, but I didn't. I couldn't. All I could feel was dread, because I didn't even know whose child it was. And before I could figure out what to do, Enzo proposed. He told me that he'd been planning it for weeks. That night, he took me to a nice dinner, got down on one knee after, and told me that I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I couldn't speak. All I could think was that I didn't deserve him, but I said yes anyway. It wasn't until after the engagement that I told him I was pregnant. It felt safer then to reveal it to him, even though I was still confused. He was so thrilled and excited that for a moment, it seemed to push my guilt to the side. And during that time, watching Enzo smile as he talked about baby names and tell me about gender-neutral colors we could paint the nursery, I almost convinced myself that maybe it didn't matter and things could all be fine. Maybe the timing worked in our favor, and maybe the baby was his. Just maybe. I decided then that I would never tell him. I knew I had to bury that night and all its consequences so deep that no one could ever dig them up. I stopped taking calls from Scott, and I stopped replying to his emails. I bent over backwards to do all the work myself just so I could avoid him, and when he tried to approach me at work, I told him it was over. He looked hurt, but he didn't fight it. A few weeks later, he transferred to another office, and that was that. That should have been that. I built a life with Enzo after that. A marriage, a home, and a future. When our son was born, Enzo cried in the hospital room and said he looked just like me. I was shaking from the whole experience, but I was happy seeing him so happy. I thought maybe things had worked out for me in the end, but as our son grew, it became obvious that wasn't the case, and it got harder to pretend. Because our son looked nothing like Enzo. Every year, it became harder to look at him without seeing the face of the man I'd betrayed Enzo with. Our son was practically Scott's spitting image, and I couldn't handle it. I tried to love him the way a mother should, and sometimes I even succeeded. But most times, I could barely look at him. That was the reason I'd been such an absent mother. Because each time I looked at our son, I was reminded of one of my worst mistakes. And the reason work had been bad wasn't just because of the long hours or the pressure, it was because of him. Scott. He had left the firm a few weeks after I'd told him I wanted nothing more to do with him, but then a few months ago, years since the last time we saw each other, he got rehired by the firm as a managing partner of all things. The same position I worked myself into after years of devoting myself to the firm. I'd been so happy when I got the promotion last year. At that time, it felt like something steady enough to cling on to in my life amidst everything else. I had no idea that Scott would one day be back to share the title with me. When I first heard the announcement, I nearly threw up. His name in the email looked unreal, like something out of a nightmare. For days, I prayed it was a different Scott, and just some weird coincidence. But when I walked into the conference room that Monday morning and saw him standing there, smiling like nothing had ever happened, all the breath in my chest disappeared. He looked the same. A little older and maybe a little more polished, but he was the same. And staring at him then, it was almost impossible to deny what I'd suspected for years about my son. Still, I told myself I could handle it. I built a life and a family. All I had to do was protect it and stay professional. And for the first few weeks, I was. I pretended not to notice when his gaze lingered on me too long in meetings, or when he found excuses to drop by my office. I didn't analyze his warm smile or pleasant tone. I ignored it all. I buried myself in work and pretended that the past had never happened. But Scott was persistent. He would accidentally run into me in the break room just to ask about my weekend or compliment my work. I'd answer politely and move on, but he didn't stop. It almost felt like he was taunting me, always popping up to talk about anything else but that night. With him, it felt like I was waiting for the other show to drop. And eventually it did. On the day before the night Enzo and I fought, I'd been one of the last to leave the office that evening. The parking lot was quiet and dim. I was tired and fumbling for my keys when I heard his voice behind me. He called my name and I froze in place for a few seconds before I turned to face him. I immediately asked him what he wanted and why he kept bothering me, and his response was that he just wanted to talk. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, his expression tightening. "I think we do. I've been seeing some things and I can't get them out of my head." I frowned then because I was confused. "What things?" He hesitated before pulling out his phone. He turned the screen toward me, and it was my social media profile. My stomach dropped when I saw that what he was showing me was a photo of Enzo, me, and our son. The picture was from a few months back at a piano recital. Scott's voice was low when he spoke again. "He looks nothing like your husband." For a second, I couldn't breathe. My mouth went dry and my throat was tight. "What are you talking about?" After that, he went off on a tangent about how he had done the math and how the timeline for my son's birth lines up perfectly with the night we spent together. I felt backed into a corner and had no choice but to snap, so I accused him of being insane. I told him he had lost his mind and that he never got over me back then, so he was creating lies just so he could get back into my life now. He shook his head slowly and his voice got louder. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but I deserve to know the truth." "Is he mine?" Those words hit me in my chest and stepped away until my back hit the car. I didn't know what to do. I only knew that I couldn't let Scott ruin what I'd worked so hard to build for myself, so I had no choice but to threaten him. "If you ever come near me again, if you ever say something like that to me again, I'll file a complaint against you. And I mean it," I warned him. He flinched at the sharpness in my voice, and that was enough for me to turn away from him and get in my car. My hands were shaking so hard that I could barely fit the key into the ignition, and my vision blurred from tears as I drove off. The entire way home, all I could think about were his words, and how my life would be over if another person had heard them. His words clung to me, and that was why the next day I was so distracted. It was why I couldn't focus on anything, and why I didn't pick up my phone when the school called. I'd forgotten everything, all my responsibilities and promises, because my mind was spinning out of control thinking about the consequences of what I'd done. By the time I remembered my son, it was already too late. And that led to the fight. When Enzo asked me what was wrong, I wanted so badly to tell him, to say that the man I'd betrayed him with was back and that he was threatening everything we'd built. But how could I? How could I possibly say that? So I lied. Again and again. I told him work was bad because of stress and not because the embodiment of my past mistakes now had an office right next to mine. The days after the fight were heavy and silent. Enzo barely spoke to me unless it was about our son. He was polite but distant. The tension in our house felt suffocating. I told myself that things would calm down and that he just needed time to be upset. I hoped that Scott had given up after that night, but I wasn't so lucky, and just a week later, he was back again. When I walked into the parking lot, there he was leaning against my car. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I asked what the hell he was doing around me. He told me that he couldn't stay away, not until he heard the truth from me. The truth? I laughed bitterly. The truth is that what happened between us was a mistake. A mistake I've spent years trying to forget. He was quiet for a long time as he studied my face. Then he moved a little bit closer and he said, "Do you really regret it?" "That night?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I wanted to say yes, to say that I wished it had never happened, but the words wouldn't form, maybe because part of me knew it wasn't that simple. He took another step forward. "You can't even say it," he whispered. His hand lifted and brushed against my cheek. The contact was so gentle and so familiar that it made my breath hitch. I froze, not because I wanted it, but because it terrified me how easily the past could come rushing back. How one touch could make me forget everything I'd built since then and toss me years into the past. Then the sound of footsteps echoed from across the lot, and that was enough to break the haze I was under. I pushed him away, hard enough that he stumbled a little. "Don't ever touch me again," I said. "If you come near me or my family, I'll tell HR everything." "I'll tell them about that night. I don't care if we both lose our jobs and I won't stop there. I'll go to the police if I have to." He looked stunned, like he wasn't expecting any of it from me. And before he could say anything else and confuse me more, I told him to stay away from me forever and forget he ever even met me before I got in my car and left. The tears came when I got back to the house. Everything just felt too heavy. All the lies, the guilt, and the fear. It felt like everything was unraveling and there was nothing I could do about it. All I could do as I moved through the house was try to convince myself that it would be okay. I kept telling myself that I just needed to hold on a little longer and things would be fine. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, Enzo was waiting for me in the living room. He wasn't dressed for work or anything, and he had a sad look on his face. I asked him what was going on, and he asked me to sit down. My heart pounded as I lowered myself onto the couch. I was already bracing for the worst. I was expecting another confrontation about our son, or about my long hours, or even maybe something much worse. But instead, he took a deep breath and rubbed the back of his neck, and in a voice that was softer than I'd heard in a while, he said, "I'm sorry." For a moment, I thought I misheard him. "What?" "I shouldn't have said you were a bad mother," he went on as his eyes remained on the floor. "I was angry." I felt like I was in it alone. With work, with him, with everything. I felt like you didn't care, but I know that's not true. I know you've been trying. The breath I'd been holding slipped out in one shaky exhale. Relief flooded through me so intensely that it hurt. I hadn't realized how much tension I'd been carrying until that moment. I slid off the couch and into his arms before I could think. "I'm sorry, too," I whispered against his shoulder. "You were right. I haven't been doing my part, and I promise, I'll do better. I'll show up. I'll try harder for both of you." He kissed my head, and we both agreed to forget it and move past it together. I felt like a hypocrite through it all. I'd never felt so guilty in my life. That night, when he finally fell asleep beside me, I couldn't close my eyes. Just hours ago, Scott's hand had been on my cheek, and his eyes were searching mine like we were right back in that living room years ago. I had almost kissed him. Almost betrayed Enzo again. And then Enzo had been the one to apologize despite it all. He had been the one to forgive, even though I was clearly in the wrong. I remember fighting back tears as I stared at the ceiling. I wondered how I could ever fix things when I had screwed everything up so badly. How could I fix any of it when such an important part of our relationship, our family, was built on a lie? I thought about it the whole night, and by morning I'd convinced myself that I could still make it right somehow. I thought that devoting myself to family instead of work would help set things right. So, I threw myself into my family with a kind of desperate energy. For weeks I was cooking breakfast, picking up our son from school, and religiously asking about Enzo's day. I wanted him to see me trying and to believe me again. And when Scott hadn't dared try to talk to me in those weeks, I genuinely thought that my plan was working and that I'd swept it all under the rug, but I was wrong. I wouldn't know how wrong I was until the small game night that we hosted every other month rolls around. It was a very casual thing. Just some friends, family, and games. I threw myself into planning that too, so much so that Enzo laughed a few times when he saw how dedicated I was to making it a great night. When the night finally arrived, it was the first time in weeks that the house felt warm and cozy again. Enzo smiled more than he had in a while, and I was happy for that. Our son was staying at my parents' house for the night, and that small freedom felt like a chance to breathe. My sister arrived late, as usual, grinning and carrying a bottle of wine. I'd been waiting for her all night because she was the only one who knew everything. She'd been the first person I called the night I found out I was pregnant all those years ago, and the one who helped convince me to stay quiet and to protect what I had with Enzo. Halfway through the night, when all the laughter echoed from the living room and everyone was talking, I pulled her into the kitchen to talk. I told her everything, all the recent things that had happened. I told her about Scott being back and how we'd had to work together again. "Jesus, you gotta be kidding me," she whispered. "After all this time?" Then I told her about how I tried to avoid him, but he kept cornering me and bringing up my son. Her expression shifted from irritated to concerned after that. She stayed quiet for a bit before she said, "Then stay away from him. Don't engage. You've got too much to lose. I know that. I've told him to stay away from me." She sighed and poured herself another glass before she smiled. "It's actually kind of funny that your kid looks absolutely nothing Enzo and you've gotten away with this far." She joked, but I didn't laugh. Then she got serious again. And that's exactly why you can't make this complicated. It's too late for the truth now. So just stay quiet. Keep your head down. Hope that Enzo continues to be blind to the whole thing, and everything will be fine. I frowned at how careless and loud she was being. I opened my mouth to tell her to lower her voice and that she wasn't being funny, but before I could, I heard an all too familiar voice behind me. What did you just say? The sound of Enzo's voice froze us both. I turned, my stomach dropping as I saw the pale, horrified look on his face. He was standing in the doorway with a half-empty glass still in his hand. I tried to say something, but he was already walking toward us, his eyes never leaving mine. Why would she say that? Why would your sister say something like that? And the hell is Scott? The entire room behind him had gone quiet. He'd left the kitchen door open as he walked in. If none of the other guests had heard all that my sister had said, they definitely heard what Enzo said. All the laughter and chatter died down, and I could feel everyone's eyes on us. Please, I said, stepping closer. It's not what you think. She was just joking, and Scott is just a coworker. Don't lie to me, he snapped, his voice breaking. I heard most of what you both said. He looked from me to my sister and back again. Tell me the truth. Is he my son? He demanded. The room seemed to spin with that question, and I could barely breathe. Everyone was watching. My sister had gone quiet beside me, and Enzo was staring at me like he hated me. I had no choice but to tell him the truth. I don't know. I finally said, I really have no idea if he is. The silence that followed was unbearable. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore, and like I turned into someone he couldn't even stand to look at. I begged him to just listen and let me explain, even though there really wasn't much else to say. I had betrayed him. Plain and simple, our son was proof of that. He didn't listen, and he didn't wait around to watch my tears. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and headed for the door. Everyone watched as I tried to follow him and grab his arm, but he turned and looked at me with something cold and final in his eyes. He looked at me like he would lose it if I touched him. Don't, he said, and that was the last of it. I watched him pull open the door and walk out. Then he was gone. Everyone was still staring. My sister stood frozen in the doorway of the kitchen, looking horrified too. I sank to the floor in the living room, and the tears flowed out of me so fast I could barely breathe. It was all just too much. The humiliation, the guilt, and the fear that he would never come back. The only thing that comforted me was knowing my son wasn't there to see it, and that he was safe at my parents' house, far from the chaos his mother had created. It's been a week since then. I haven't heard a word from Enzo. My calls go straight to voicemail, and my texts are left unread. My mother told me he came by a few days ago to pick up our son, but he obviously didn't tell her where he was taking him. She said he looked tired, like a man that couldn't decide if he wanted to be heartbroken or angry. I don't know where they are. I don't know how to reach them. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now or how to fix something this broken. I just know that somewhere out there, my husband is keeping my son from me, and, I don't know, maybe after everything I've done, he's right to do it. But it doesn't make it hurt any less, or make me any less terrified for what's to come.